Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to hopefully start on time and end on time today. So it is 1 o'clock for those in the middle of this country. And welcome, everyone. My name is Arlene MacDonald, and I'm a private consultant with Capacity for Impact Consulting and a member of the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition's Coordinating Committee. And it's my pleasure today to extend a warm welcome to everyone that's joining us. Today, we are happy to be talking about best practices for nonprofits that are using data. So hopefully that's what you think you signed up for. But before we dive into the conversation and before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge the physical and virtual spaces and the lands that we're all joining from today. I'm joining myself from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral beautiful lands of the Mi'kmaq people, and I'm a settler on this territory, and I want to express my gratitude for the gift that is, and acknowledge the responsibility that I have to care for that gift. And I also want to acknowledge the people of African descent who have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and I want to honor those ancestors and all our ancestors and invite their wisdom into our hearts and into this space with us today. And I'm going to invite Asia to say a few words, and I invite others to share in the chat the territories that you're all joining from. So Asia, if you'd like to say a few moments, and then we'll continue with a few more logistics.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much, Arlene and Ryan. My name is Asia Mason. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Yukon Status of Women Council, which is located in the Yukon Territory. And we benefit, just want to make that unambiguously clear that we benefit and continue to benefit from the traditional territories of the Ta'an-Quatchin Council and the Kwanlin First Nation here around Whitehorse, and recognizing that as a third generation colonist and settler, that the work that we do is very much reliant on and enabled by the lands and the peoples whom we have colonized. So thank you.
Thank you, Asia. So today we have a lot of ground to cover, so we are not going to do a question and answer during the session, but we're continuing to plan webinars. This is the third webinar that we've hosted, and we're thinking about resources that would be useful. So please feel free to add your questions, drop resource links, etc., into the chat, and we'll definitely note them for future, perhaps, webinar topics. And today's webinar, really what our goal is to present a tasting menu and some best practices rather than giving an exhaustive, in-depth tutorial in an hour. And we want to give you some food for thought and hopefully some tools and nuggets of information that'll help you with your own research and learning. And just to let people know that the meeting's being recorded and you will receive the recording within a few weeks, along with any resources that have come up throughout the hour. Closed captioning is enabled. And if you have further accessibility questions, please let us know in the chat. I want to acknowledge Emily, who's in the background, keeping us technologically moving along, because we wouldn't want to rely on me for that. So this webinar is organized by the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition. And for those that maybe aren't familiar with the coalition, the group focuses on advancing the nonprofit sector's priorities in terms of data collected and shared. And to this date, we've focused on the federal government's products. And it includes over 40 different organizations and institutions. And if you're interested in learning more, or if you're interested in joining us, please let us know either in the chat or you can reach out to publicpolicy@imaginecanada.ca, and I'm sure that link will be populated in the chat for you as well. So hopefully this will help us build the sector's awareness about sector data and the capacity that data has to further all of our missions. So my role here today is just to moderate and create space for Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, so much for graciously joining us at really the very last minute. And Asia, it's always a pleasure for me to see both of you and to have the opportunity to learn from you both. So I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into some more formal questions. So Ryan, you're right next to me on my screen. So how about if I invite you to go first?
Oh, by all means, Asia, please, you can go ahead.
I feel like I already did me by accident.
Oh,
Yeah, please go ahead, Ryan.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the intro, Arlene. Always good to see you. My name is Ryan Knight, one of the co-founders of the Afro Caribbean Business Network, and also a board member of SETSI, which is the Social Economy Through Social Inclusion. So ACBN, we work with entrepreneurs of African and Caribbean heritage, really to figure out what stage their business is in, and help them create a strategy to grow their companies exponentially. And also we started our own microloan program, and we also started a social enterprise which helps entrepreneurs with their marketing and sales. And we were one of the first organizations to do a Black labor market study in Canada. So we're really excited about those results, and that data has been helping us make a lot better decisions going forward. So happy to talk about our journey.
Thank you, Ryan, and fascinating work. So lots to learn from you. Asia, anything you want to add to your introduction before I move on to the questions now that Ryan's
Yeah, thanks so much, Arlene. So just for a bit of context, as I'm the executive director, like I mentioned, of a small but mighty nonprofit organization that has a mandate to promote gender justice in the Yukon territory. But we're very backline, meaning we use community-based research, policy analysis, and education to fulfill our mandate. And the thing that I want to communicate is just how unusual it is in the Yukon territory, especially given that we have such a small population size. So we're talking about the size of, what do they say, France or something like that. And there's maybe 45,000 people who live in the Yukon territory. And you add on top of that what it is that we do, which is often looking at things like gender-based violence. So we've already got a situation in place where we can't often use a lot of the kinds of data methodologies that exist down south, where there's a really high relative population size compared to the Yukon. And secondly, the fact that we're often working in issues or around issues where there's significant underreporting of the actual issues. So for example, very few people who experience gender-based violence choose to report through formal channels. And those channels that are the formal channels are often the data collection mechanisms. So you kind of have this compounding double entendre effect in the Yukon, where we've got really small population sizes. And when we try to hone in on specific kinds of issues, so for example, looking at how certain kinds of policy decisions might impact, say, for example, Indigenous or racialized women, we don't have access reliably or in a meaningful way. We do not have access to disaggregated data in these contexts, which means that making decisions that are informed by evidence becomes a bit more tricky in these locales. So that's sort of that's the impetus that I'm coming with here today, and would love to share some of the strategies and ideas and just some of the sort of fundamentals that we've encountered over the last handful of years. So looking really forward to this conversation, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Asia. And yet Yukon is such a unique territory for this country. It's such a huge geographical span and so much uniqueness across the entire landscape. you've already sort of started to, I think, lead us into what was going to be my first question. And it's, if someone's just starting at the beginning, they're just thinking about starting data collection, what are some of the issues that they should be keeping in mind before they start? So you already gave us an example around some of the limits and being aware of those. So wondering, Asia, maybe if you want to just continue with some of what you've already started to say, and then Ryan, please, would love to hear, what your advice is when someone's just getting started, and not just what the issues are, but some things that you've both found useful to help address some of those issues.
Thanks, Arlene. Yeah, I think it's important just to get our definitions somewhat sort of straight, so to speak. And for us, defining what it is that data actually is an important first step. Recognizing that data is just raw figures, facts that are unorganized, unprocessed. And these measurements, so to speak, they really don't have any use unless we design and engage with these unprocessed raw facts and figures meaningfully. So I'll say that a little bit differently. Data is a human construct. They're facts, figures, numbers that are unprocessed, that are imbued with meaning in the ways in which we think that we're going to use those data. I think a lot of folks who don't have like a science, like very like Western colonized background, often are a bit overwhelmed or intimidated by the idea of data and what it actually is, when in fact we are swimming in oceans of data all the time. I think also it's important for us to keep in mind that given what we're talking about here is data in the not-for-profit sector, and recognizing also that the not-for-profit sector is like the third sector. It sort of straddles private, public spheres. We're often funded predominantly by governments, which means that we're often in a situation where we're imposed with data governance frameworks or data collection frameworks. Those are the kinds of key indicators that the funders want to see. So recognizing that from the get-go, the vast majority of not-for-profits are already being bound to certain kinds of data governance frameworks without even maybe recognizing that. And furthermore, I think that there's an important point here with respect to the difference between the kinds of data and the sheer volume of data that are being collected by your smartwatch, your smartphone. The private sector is amassing vast quantities, like I don't even know what the Latin prefix term is for bytes, like but like terabytes of data that the private sector has access to. And when we think about how data and data access and so forth are regulated at the level of, say, the federal or, say, provincial or territorial level, we're talking about things like access to information, privacy acts, health information protection management acts, and so forth, where we have this really big chasm that's developing in the data landscape, where we're sort of invisibly handing over crap tons of data to the private sector in a very kind of innocuous and inconspicuous way. And yet we lean really heavily and hard into things like confidentiality, considerations of what is shared with governments. And I just want to flag here that this is very much part of what I consider to be a neoliberal agenda, where we're essentially promoting greater access to the private spheres to data, and simultaneously limiting the ways in which governments, no matter what order of government, and by extension, not-for-profits, limiting how much access to quality data these sectors have. So there's something embedded here that I hope we can talk a little bit more about, and I'm going to wrap this up with some final comments just about what constitutes quality data, right? We've defined data as being these raw facts and figures imbued with meaning as a function of how we're going to use it, or how the end user wants the data to be framed into something more meaningful. But then we also have to ask ourselves, what is it that constitutes quality data? The vast majority of data that we have access to, at least not in the private sector where we're not collecting terabytes of data from smartwatches, quality data is well documented. It's complete, meaning it's machine readable, you can use it, leverage it, it's usable, it's reusable, it's reliable, it's timely, relevant, and it's accessible. And I would add to that list of things that define quality data as also being disaggregatable. So I'm going to pass it to Ryan and see if you want to riff off of that.
Well, I love to add to when you're talking about the multitudes of data that's being given. And when you're thinking of starting a project that's going to collect data, and Stephen Covey says it best, where you start with the end in mind. It's like, what is the data going to help you to actually do? And what we found is that we were trying to empower Black entrepreneurs. So that end goal, we had to then look at, okay, who else is trying to empower Black entrepreneurs so that the data that we're collecting would be able to be beneficial to them. And a mistake that we made with, and this was back in, I think, 2019, where we did initial research studies of our entrepreneurs just to say, okay, we want to find out how they're feeling, but we didn't realize who else could benefit from that information. So one checkbox that could have fixed it all, just to say like, hey, by giving us this data, we are gonna expose you to the broader Black entrepreneurship ecosystem. So that if there's something in a strategy that comes out of the data, we can then connect them to the support that they need. But without them giving that permission, then we have to start from scratch. So another organization also has to do the research. And then that's where people get really fatigued with the amount of data collection, the amount of surveys that's out there. So one thing that we're realizing is as we're building out these big data models and we're asking for information, and I'm a nerd for spreadsheets, but spreadsheets can be so overwhelming. And I love to see numbers and how they tell stories. But then we have to pull those stories out and use it to actually make better decisions. So that's where a spreadsheet that now has X information, if we're not realizing how that tells the actual human story and it just stays at, and I love Statistics Canada, but just a website of numbers does not help us truly make decisions or understand the story that people are going through. So when we use our research methodologies to then have more conversations based on the results we're finding, we actually realize that people do want to share their stories, but they don't want to be extracted. They want to see that the data that you're collecting is actually going to move the needle forward, support them very tangibly in a way that will benefit their lives. And then when you show them the macro level to say, this information that you're giving actually supports the broader Black entrepreneurship community on a whole, they love to be part of that. They love to be part of the broader vision and the true empowerment. So if we're not thinking of who is currently empowering the community and how the data that we're collecting will support them, that's where we usually miss the mark. And I've noticed a lot of organizations that have much bigger data sets than us, it turns into a silo of them hoarding that information. When if we got access to it, we could actually make better decisions for the residents that we support. So that siloism, we definitely have to get around that. And sometimes it's as easy as a checkbox within the intake form to say, we are part of a broader ecosystem and we want you to know that and be totally transparent and upfront. And then once that data is available, having additional conversations. So it's not just a survey and it gets parked on a shelf, because that has been very frustrating as well for people that participate in these things. And then they follow up with you to say, like, oh, so yeah, we did a focus group, we did a full survey, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of my life. What happened? And it's like, well, that got submitted to the government and it's on somebody's desk. And it's now just irrelevant. So we want to definitely keep away from that.
I mean, great points, both you and data access and the acts and regulations and just some of those things about thinking about what is data, what is quality data. And I think we both really made the point about the importance of data not being the whole story, that it's something that leads to questions, it, requires interpretation and all kinds of other things. So it kind of leads me into, and you both started to speak to this a bit already around data usage. So, once you found data, especially data that's been collected by someone else, you've not been part of the data collection process, perhaps, um, but it's relevant to the project that you're working on. What are some of the best practices that you'd suggest keeping in mind when you're using that data? And I know, Ryan, you mentioned about how important it is to be sharing data and going back out and validating it and things like that. So perhaps I'll start with you in thinking,
Sure.
what are some of the best practices, especially using others' data?
Yeah, and definitely learning from our elders. One thing that I've learned from Elder Errol Gibbs, that we've worked together to do a Black Empowerment Manifesto, is this, it's like you have to dig into what exists. We did 50 years of research, or 50 years, over the last 50 years, all the research that's been done on the Black community. If ACBN came out the gate and said, we're about to do another survey, all of those people that for the past 50 years have been part of these research studies, part of those reports, part of these government programs, everything that they've been part of, they're now most likely exhausted. And us being relatively new, we're only 6 years old, it's very disrespectful to the past work. So understanding like what data has already been collected, and then engaging with those organizations that have done the work, so that you can explain how you're adding to the work instead of starting from scratch. And that's where you don't get a lot of collaboration, because when you put something new out there and people see what you're doing, but it's already been done, that breeds resentment. They're like, well, why didn't you come and talk to me about what we've already been doing? I've seen too many reports come out, and a very identical report came out the year before, and both of those entities did not talk to each other at all. And we got to the same conclusion like a year apart. Whereas if we had built upon what already existed and took the time to do the research on what others have got, what data others have already gotten, we'd be so much further ahead. Instead, we're always spinning our wheels and starting back from square one. So that's where I've noticed we have to respect, and I say our elders because they've done so much work up to this point, to add to it so that we can use it as a foundation instead of trying to build a foundation again from scratch.
Yeah, there's so much amazing work that's been done and is being done. And, it's definitely a great point, Ryan, not just to respect that work, but to engage with those that have done the work, which is, a practice, I think, of in respecting other people's work. Asia, same question to you. What are some of the best practices that you would suggest people keep in mind?
Ryan's points about open access to data and just data access, period. I think that we have been really well trained, especially for folks who work in the not-for-profit sector, to prioritize individual confidentiality above and beyond anything else, which is not to say that that's not a very important feature to consider, obviously, but we've definitely adopted a bit of an all or nothing mentality with respect to data, where, just like Ryan was saying, it can be as simple as in the sort of preamble of the survey indicating that, hey, we intend to use this data above and beyond just the mandate of this or scope of this project, for example. This is part of a whole school of thought around, things like smart cities and open access to data, and recognizing that the silos Ryan mentioned, those exist because of how we've structured data governance decisions in particular. So we rely on funders to potentially link us to similar initiatives that might be happening, but funders don't often have the capacity to do so. I also want to make a couple of points here about a recent project that the Yukon Status Women Council worked on. So we received some funding to explore the impacts of COVID on women and women-identified folks here in the Yukon Territory. We obtained data sets from Stats Canada, Yukon Bureau of Statistics, and the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. In particular, our project was questioning how COVID impacted the capacity to earn income, but also looking at beyond livelihood measures of well-being. And here's the catch. We also built into this project interviews with folks. So 2 to 3 hour long interviews. We interviewed something like, it was over 50 people, and we conducted a survey. And again, this is the Yukon. So these are big numbers for us. And we had about 150 responses to the survey. The point I want to get across here is that when we probed the data sets that we acquired from StatsCan, Yukon Bureau of Stats, and the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, and we probed those data sets specifically for the effects that we were questioning, but specifically wanted to know how Indigenous and racialized women in those data sets, how their experiences were reflected compared to the data that we were collecting. And here's the catch, is that we couldn't disaggregate any of those other data sources. We could not ask any of the data sets that were already in existence from StatsCan, Yukon Bureau of Stats, and the Canadian Index of Wellbeing what the impacts were with all of the questions in relation to Indigenous and racialized women. However, when we analyzed the data that we collected through thematic analysis and quantitative, methodologies, the difference between Indigenous and racialized women's experiences compared to Caucasian women's experiences they weren't even on the same map. So thinking about how we can think about quality data as we're getting these data sets from these huge repositories such as Stats Canada, and recognizing that there are things called suppression rules that limit what can be done with those data that are collected in these other sort of ventures, right? So in effect, if we relied only on these sort of very notable data repositories to tell us what was happening in the Yukon in that time frame, it would have erased all of the experiences and continued to invisibilize the experiences of Indigenous and racialized women.
Yeah, you missed so much.
Yeah, excellent point.
And even just to add to that, because that's what we found, where we saw there's like 130,000 Black entrepreneurs that are in Canada, but only 27,000 of them are registered. And then in that small pocket that's actually registered, there's so much nuance where we paint a complete brush of small business for everybody, where a person that is by themselves can't be compared to a person that has 50 employees. So it's like drilling down to understand what specific segments need what. Because if we just do a broad generalized program, and this is what we're seeing happen, where programs get created and a person that is established and ready to scale is in a workshop talking about marketing 101. It's like we have to be able to support those that need marketing 101 with their specific programs, and then those that need more advanced, I would say, programming specifically for them. But when we just do broad things, and that's where I again, I love the Statistics Canada, but it keeps information too broad, where we can't really segment to say what area of the population needs what, because it doesn't disaggregate, especially by race in the entrepreneurship realm. We're not seeing it, so we have to do it ourselves, and then we're finding it drills down so deep that, yeah, it gets frustrating because people are just being researched to death. And I'm like, people say to me, listen, I have been researched beyond my comfort level, and Ryan, this is the last survey I am ever doing. So it's like, I have to like beg them, just like make this the last one.
Yeah, lots of survey fatigue, I think, but I think you both made a good point about why it's so important to follow up on some of these formal data sets that we rely on, and policymakers, government, and others rely on to make decisions. It's the sense making really that comes through the surveys and the interviews that you mentioned, Asia, and the work that you were talking about, Ryan. And I mean, it's an excellent point for people that are just starting on their data journey, and keeping in mind, the limits of these data sets and what's not in there. And just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not exists. That term, suppressed data, it speaks volumes around the colonialism really of our systems and who disappears within them. So Excellent points. Thank you both. So before we get into kind of a bit more general tips, one last, I think, more specific question. We promised people some themes around data storage and management. So once we have the data collected, thinking about, you know, how do you store and manage that data? I know with the Decolonizing Data Institute, Ryan, we've had conversations about the responsibility that's inherent when you collect data. So perhaps if one of you'd like to speak to that.
You want to start, Asia? Well, I know because we've talked about the Decolonizing Data Institute, and because Capital W has done such immense work with collecting information about charities, and then the research that we've done with, entrepreneurs and across Canada being part of the Black entrepreneurship ecosystem, something that starts to come to mind when just dealing with Black entrepreneurs and the different organizations is everybody wants to be the central body. And so then when everybody's collecting data, and then you start to talk about collaboration, okay, can we create a centralized node? It gets to be very, what's the nice way to put it? It's competitive, I guess you could say. And instead of being collaborative, it turns into competition because a person that, let's say, has better data or larger data sets feels like they should be the central node, and an organization that feels like they have more impactful data and ask better questions, they should be the central node. And sometimes egos, like Ryan, just feels our data, we are the best organization, so why aren't we the node? So this is where it was important for something like the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub to be created, where that hub can now allow organizations that all are collecting our own data, and all of us don't have to decide, okay, who's going to be the central node. We can plug into another body that can now use that data, use the research, and really amplify the work that's being done by everybody. Because when we're infighting about who should be the lead organization, work does not get done. But when there's a body that we can look to and say, okay, we are doing this work, we would love to house it here, and then you with your academics can dig in and find the stories and then report back to us on how we can be better. I feel like that's becoming a better model, and it took 4 years for us to get there, but I see how it's progressing, and it's a lot better than the model that we had in the past.
Asia, your thoughts? Data storage and management responsibility.
I mean, there's best practices, and we all have Google, and we can pretty quickly see just things like, from a very pragmatic level, encryption, and as soon as you can, making sure that, for example, if you're collecting data that involves people's stories or direct transcripts or recordings, where you're scrubbing anything and transcribing everything as quickly as possible within very, very, limited time frame. So for example, you don't want to have on your hard drive recorded audio of those 3-hour long conversations that you've had with folks, where you can tell their accent and you can tell a lot from just hearing somebody's voice in a small place like the Yukon. It's not hard to identify folks, right? I just plugged into the chat. Maybe people are wondering what this is about, but I just want to flag this. So we're seeing more and more in the Yukon territory, at least in the transfer payment agreements between the Yukon government and NGOs or not-for-profits, clauses that are being added. So I put in, you can see in the chat, clause number 10 in our current transfer payment agreement essentially bestows unlimited power on behalf of our core funder, which is the Yukon government. And I'll just mention also, not to rag too hard on government here, but recognizing that we get $49,000 a year of core funding from the Yukon government. We report on every single project that we are doing that is funded from other funders, but by virtue of having to report on every project funded by other funders, this clever clause enables the Yukon government to essentially have access to everything that we have stored. And I'm flagging it here because Oh, thanks, Emily. Thank you for putting that in there. Sorry, folks. So looking here at, and there's another clause that I'm just plugging in, recognizing that your TPA actually, or sorry, your transfer payment agreements or your contribution agreements may have clauses that are binding your organization to unencumbered free rein access to certain stakeholders or actors, for lack of a better term, or in this case, folks who and entities who have power over you as an organization. This is really, really critical because when we're framing the limitations on who can access those data when we're collecting data and doing the preambles, right? When we're saying this is how we're going to use the data and we promise to like blah, 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 or blee, blee, blee. What's not necessarily communicated to the folks participating is that, yeah, also, and government can have free rein access to this by virtue of the kinds of TPAs that we've signed. This isn't every jurisdiction. I just want to flag that as well. There's definitely a lot of variation, but thinking here about the larger ramifications around trust in relationship to the folks who we're, amplifying lived experience and voices with, for example, but also trust of government and recognizing that we are entering an era where data is not only currently very, very powerful, but it will continue to be extremely commodified. And the ways in which government informs their decisions with data and the quality of those data can start with us as individual organizations. But we run the risk of replicating a lot of silos, like Ryan was discussing, because there isn't that connective tissue, and because we have things like this in our TPAs, where it already imbues a sense of paranoia is not the right word, but just like a bit of concern, trepidation that, hey, like, am I writing checks here on this like survey preamble that I can't cash? Am I guaranteeing privacy here that I actually don't have the legal grounds to guarantee? And so again, recognizing that perhaps granular individual driven data isn't always going to be the answer, especially in sectors like the gender-based violence sector, for example, in places like rural, remote, and northern, very underpopulated spots where we ultimately often will never have access to and the ability to store data in the ways that we need or ought to have in order to make those evidence-informed decisions. And so the Yukon Status Women Council has been leaning pretty hard into this topic of late and arguing that we do need a paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift where we are looking at communities as the unit of measurement, not individual headcounts, where we can rely on measures of things like infrastructure, things like policy frameworks, things we know and are very clearly demonstrated in all the literature, whatever you want to say. What is it that builds healthy, caring, resilient communities in the absence of quality, accessible, reliable, safe data? Thanks.
That's a good question, Asia. Yes.
But I was so curious, Asia, and to get your thoughts on as you started to navigate, because that was something that we're learning, let's call them like trip up clauses in your contribution agreements, where you realize you don't have the flexibility to do things that you might have envisioned, and how you navigate being able to work, especially collaboratively with other organizations that might have similar clauses. What are you finding that's working well as you're collaborating with other folks?
Yeah, and again, not to be all or nothing about this, but I, as somebody who's been in the realm of data science for a very long time, and being asked often to talk about the most recent StatsCan report, for example, that just came out.
Right.
And then also having like very rigorous evidence about the lack of data. So there's one thing to talk about data advocacy, and then I'm riffing here off of a lot of the work that I've been doing with an organization called Open North, which I highly recommend connecting with if folks aren't familiar with Open North. They're an NGO based in Canada, and they promote data governance framework development and open access to data and so forth. But this piece around understanding fundamentally what's the actual value when, I know Ryan mentioned the macro level of things, right? So say you're an individual executive director of a not-for-profit who's doing a project that's going to collect a bunch of data. You've done your homework, you've connected with other orgs who are doing similar initiatives. The likelihood that you're going to be able to compare your apples to some other NGO's apples is really, really low. And I'm saying this not because I'm citing some paper, but I'm certain that there's a research project in here where if we looked at and measured the level of coherence, so we call this like an independent component analysis. If we had the entire alphabet from A through Z of NGOs and we compared each one, we compared A to L, like individually as NGOs, and said, what are the data you're collecting? Is it even comparable to the NGO Z over here? The likelihood that they're comparable or even like usable like in an how do I say this, integrated way is very, very low. And so it begs the question, to what end? To what end are we collecting these data? And I think it benefits organizations, especially organizations that are doing a lot of advocacy with data, to recognize the limitations around what that data can do for you. And that means on a very practical level, look into your provincial or territorial legislation. How is evidence defined? How is evidence defined? How in the legislation has evidence been linked to how decisions are made? These are really important questions because often we don't even realize within the NGO sector that we have more data and more leverage to build what constitutes evidence compared to a lot of these hegemonic institutions like government. All of which is to say, we can, if we have a good view of the landscape from not only the level of, these are my friends and family who I'm talking to, who I live in community with, that are telling me their stories, recognizing also that folks cannot ensure, just like Ryan was saying, we can't even ensure that we can do something meaningful with those stories unless we're very literate and have a really firm understanding of how to leverage those stories as evidence and pushing back against a lot of the legislation that in principle sounds good, but in practice is actually like a total crapshoot.
And it's interesting you mentioned the comparison between organizations. And I want to give a shout out to Alterna Savings and Susan Henry, because we're part of their microloan program. Like they're the financial institution that backs our loans. They were able to coordinate all of the microloans that they operate and then bring us to the table to say, can we even define impact, define how we're going to measure impact based on these loans, and then try to find software that's going to aggregate all of this data so that we can compare across what everybody's doing. So it touches exactly on what you're saying, because we do these things in silos, yet we don't really define terms for each other. And then if it's not defined, we can't even compare because we're not talking the same talk. So I appreciate you mentioned, I'm going to watch this replay so I can take more notes, but thank you, Aja.
I've definitely been sitting as a learner as I listen to you.
I know, right?
So it's fabulous. And I mean, I think that's, it's really important. We've been having a very vibrant conversation now for a few years in the sector around trust-based philanthropy, but we've not really delved, I don't think, as deeply into the conversation about how that extends to data and those contract clauses that you shared, Asia. I actually just recently, for the very first time, saw a very similar contract in one of the departments from the Nova Scotia government, which has incited quite a conversation because it does, you mentioned, and Ryan, you both touched on this, the promises you make to the people that you're collecting information from around their privacy and how that data is going to be used, and your ability to have direction and control over that once it's in the hands of an institution like government. So thank you. Those are critical points that that were raised. And as we sort of come to the end of our time, any other general tips or things that you think are critical for people to think about or consider as they are, trying to make better use of data, do better around their data collection or usage or storage? Any last thoughts you'd like to share? Ryan, perhaps I'll invite you to go first.
Sure. And as you were just talking, Arlene, it reminds me of the current contract that we have with FedDev. And we got funded as an ecosystem. There's like 45 organizations, and all of us report to FedDev, or the comparable regional development agency in their part of Canada. But we didn't create a way to report to ourselves. So now FedDev, that regional development agency, is collecting all these performance reports, but we've not created a way for it to support all of the organizations that are doing the work. So that's where beginning with the end in mind is so important, because if we knew at the beginning and came to the table to coordinate how this type of funding was going to roll out, we'd be able to utilize and leverage our data a lot more effectively. And then, Asia, you're talking about the suppressed data now. So all of us sign our contribution agreements, and individually we feel, oh, but I can't share with you because of privacy. So because we didn't think of it ahead of time, we're now operating and all the information is being extracted out of the Black community and potentially can be used by government to further their agenda, instead of us leveraging that rich, valuable information across Canada, as much as 20 to 30,000 entrepreneurs deep, to one, leverage for additional funding, and two, just for better decision making. Like the programs that we are doing, we did our labor market study in the middle of our project, and we had to pause everything that we were doing because the data showed us we weren't creating programs relevant to the entrepreneurs that we're serving. So we had to revamp and actually create programs that would help them grow their companies and make them feel their time is valuable or worth their time to engage with our programming. If people are coming through and it's over like close to $100 million, and at the end of it, entrepreneurs are not satisfied with the support that they got, that's a colossal failure. So we had to make sure and get it right. It's like if you're on the wrong track, be humble enough to stop the train, get onto the right track, and then continue going forward. So those last tips is really the humility to do the research on what your elders have done, and being humble enough to use the data and let that data tell the story, and not just force your story on the survey recipients to further your own agenda. I feel if we do it where we're letting people tell their stories and making decisions from that, it's a lot more impactful.
Thank you, Ryan. Those are great last points to make. Asia, I invite you to do the same.
Yeah, so much. Just, I guess, recognizing fundamentally that data is never neutral. It's never just about data. Data is in many ways, and I'm quoting something that Open North has done a really great job of popularizing. Data it's about the very arrangements of power, of profit, inclusion, equality that structure our society. And just like Ryan said, there's, I think, a lot of attention being paid right now from multiple orders of government with respect to having things like, and whether it's conscious or not, or intentional or not, I'm not suggesting well, we won't go down that rabbit hole. It's right with these clauses in these contribution agreements that allow for unilateral, unidirectional flow of information, where we're not necessarily getting a feedback loop.
Exactly.
Right? There's nothing that's coming back to, right? Let's just spell it out really, really candidly. So you collect a bunch of data, you submit it to your funders. The funders then perhaps add that to a not-for-profit-esque data repository. Then the data repository has suppression rules that prohibit access to certain data sets in such a way that you can now no longer query or probe about gender and race, for example, in the same question. You've now ended up in a situation where we've essentially enabled access to information in a very unidirectional way under the guise of somehow promoting better decision-making and evidence-informed decision-making. This is false, and I think that there's going to be some pushback, especially as we start considering spaces like the Yukon, where of the 14 First Nations in the Yukon territory, 11 of the 14 First Nations are self-governing and are in the process of developing their own data sovereignty, data governance processes, which is amazing and great. However, even more silos. So again, I think we've fetishized individual-driven data. We've put almost too much emphasis or promise on it, in the sense that on a micro scale, for sure, when we're doing individual projects and it's tight and we're trying to develop what are some key performance indicators or some like metrics we can use to evaluate the efficacy of this individual program. But on a macro scale, like Ryan was saying, it's a massive ocean of data and we're swimming in it, but we can't drink it. We can't drink a lot of that water. We simply cannot, right? And I'm quoting somebody in our federal data working group, Marie, who coined this term. And lastly, I think this is, folks might laugh at this, but it's some male pale stale economist, John Maynard Keynes, or Keynes, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, which there's a lot of truth here, right? There's nothing that a government hates more than to be well informed, for it makes the process of arriving at decisions more complicated and more difficult. Again, this isn't to rag on government per se, but recognizing that this process we've been undergoing for the last couple decades is a very intentional process that allows for deregulation, for the degradation of common good and public spaces, and ultimately control. And for us, I want to believe in and promote democratization of data and reliable, trustworthy governments. But these are the kind of how do they say this? Where the devil lies, right? Is in these kinds of details, where we start mapping it out and you start connecting the dots and you're like, something's not adding up here. We have an obligation, I think, not only to the folks we work with, but also an obligation to future generations to recognize that if we're not more critical about these effects pathways and how data is or is not accessible, especially when we're the, what do they say this? The foot soldiers, we're the ones on the front line, we're the faces, we're putting our institutional and organizational reputations on the line in order to collect these data. Yeah, we definitely need to push back, I think, collectively, and recognize that data democratization and the ways in which we're doing the dirty work for a lot of governments has implications for us now and for the future. Sorry, I just went off on a spiel there.
Yeah, and by all means, we love it, because it's amazing how valuable data is. And to tell a quick story, the research that we were able to do back in 2019, if we had only used it for ourselves, ACBN, we might have unlocked $1-2 million. But because we were able to add it to the aggregate of the other organizations, we were able to unlock $100 million plus. So just to, and again, it shows you why people hoard it, because data is so valuable. But if you take it seriously to collect data and can tell proper stories and make good decisions, it will unlock funding for you. But think of it not only in the micro and your grassroots work that you're doing, if you connect it to the macro, it exponentially grows. And I've seen it firsthand.
Thank you, Ryan. That's a really great way, I think, to close the conversation, and you both made some excellent points. I love that term, there's no neutral data, because it's so true. And your point, Ryan, about the humility to respect the work of others and to work with others is really important, because you're right, it's become a commodity, really, data. And so, we risk entering into this sort of a capitalistic framework around data. We're not careful about things like data extraction and weaponization, which you also, both touched on, and how important, that is in our history for us to understand what that means and the impact it's had. And I think the farther away you get from the origin of the data, the more risk there is that data is going to be potentially, at the very least, misinterpreted, weaponized, at the other extent. So thank you, both of you, very much for your insights and the thoughtfulness of your responses, and just the expertise of the information that you've shared. I invite everybody to check out the chat and to see there's been some downloaded resources in the chat, which we mentioned at the beginning we'll be sharing. So I want to thank you both, Asia and Ryan, always a pleasure. Thank you everyone for having joined us today. And we will be having another webinar coming up on May 29th, presenting the results of the latest surveys. We talk about the limitations of Stats Canada information, government information. We'll keep that in mind as we listen to them talk about the data that they have finally, after many long years, 20 years, collected on behalf of our sector. So we'll all get busy interpreting what that really means. But thanks to everyone, and hopefully we will see everyone again on May 29th. And I also encourage you to check out the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition. We would love to see more people join our little group. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, have a good rest of the day.